right. Well, I've got Kyla Gillespie here, and we are having our second conversation on the podcast. But Kyla, we've talked more than just two times.
Right.
So it's fun that we get to be friends from coast to coast of our country, Canada. So, of course, I'm on our East Coast, you're on our West Coast. And for folks that maybe missed the first episode that you did with us or missed you talking at our conferences or lots of the conferences that you've been speaking at lately, what's your give that snapshot from your website that kind of reveals so much of your story in like just two or three sentences?
Right. So I grew up in a Christian home and pretty much all through my life played hockey at a high level in my late 20s, National Women's Hockey League. And from there, just really wrestled and struggled with gender dysphoria and same-sex attraction. Not really knowing what to do with any of it, I kind of gave up on following Jesus in my early 20s, I would say. And then I actually had a really big wrestle with even alcohol at the time. And through all that process of 11 years of living, this life and being an alcoholic, I realized that my life was broken. And in 2011, I went into recovery, which ended up being a Christian facility. And just through that process, God met me in such a powerful way. But here's the thing, like I transitioned in 2011 from female to male, and I was born a biological female, but in that process fully lived as male for 6 years. And then I met these people in a church that just loved Jesus more than themselves. We grew as friends and became close, and I just wanted to share everything with them. And so I ended up detransitioning in 2017 after 6 years of living not my biological sex as male and detransitioning to my biological sex. And now it's been just about 7 years, and I'm living my life as my biological sex female and as my given name, Kyla.
So that is like so much wrapped into just cover it. So yeah,
Right.
we've got the conversation you and I had, but you've been on a few podcasts. You've shared your story. It's obviously wild. People will want to check
Right.
that out. But now you came along the ride with us. We did some conferences in our country of Canada, and had you share both your story, but then also give people an opportunity to ask you questions, because it's a fascinating journey to see somebody who has experienced what you have, and continue in this current reality of the last number of years of following Jesus and wanting Jesus to speak into, all areas
Right.
of your life. I would love for you just to share with, just as we're kind of wrestling with the big questions here, what are some of the things that you've heard from people as they respond to you sharing your story about following Jesus, about detransitioning? What do people, if it's youth workers or students, what do they say to you after you talk? Or what do they come up and ask you
Yeah.
when they hear you?
I'm blessed by the amount of people from even our conferences, the five that we did all across Canada, is just the reception of people being so thankful for me to share my story and step out in, like it is a lot of vulnerability in sharing my story and testimony when you don't know what people are going to say or think. But at the end of the day, I want Jesus to be glorified and him to be honored with the things that he's asked. So I get a lot of questions such as, okay, so I actually know somebody, or I have a family member, or even I get like my child is wrestling and struggling with this. I don't think we're naive to not know the culture that we live in Canada, and it's like everywhere we go we hear about the transgender conversation, and so we're impacted in some degree. And if we're not impacted, I'm getting the questions like, okay, like I love Jesus and I want to disciple and love my youth, and how do I do that if, one, they're coming out like off the streets or from schools and they don't know Jesus, and they're coming with these wrestles and struggles, even identifying somewhere on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. How do I love them without sacrificing or tainting the truth? And that's a hard one. It's like, how do we hold that? And I think, like, I love the verse John 1:14, where it says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so it's embodying that, grace and truth. We're not going to do it perfectly, but I love at the youth workers conferences when I'm engaging with even youth workers, is that desire to want to do both in a godly, really Jesus way. And then as I'm walking, and speaking in other areas, just seeing youth really struggling in this area, like, I want to follow Jesus, but I don't know how to do that. And then they see my life. And for the first time, a lot of times they're like, oh my goodness, she loves Jesus and she wrestles with these things. So I think that maybe I could follow Jesus.
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, there's reports obviously that among students. So, this podcast, we're volunteers,
Yeah.
we're youth workers convinced that Jesus matters to the next generation. We want them to know him. And then, as you've referenced, we have so many examples, and I was just pulling up the report because there's recent ones, U.S. data. I'm trying to find the Canadian one, couldn't quite find it, but 1 in 4 teenagers in our youth ministries identify as part of the LGBT community.
Yeah.
And I think that probably is actually a little bit higher now. That's from a couple of years ago, maybe even higher in Canada. And so this idea that, you've got people coming to you and you're like, okay, that was your story. It's the story of so many of our students. Yeah. It's not just an academic exercise. It's a personal one.
Right.
What am I supposed to do in light of that, if anything? And so what do you think, if you think about our youth groups as an example, and, volunteers that are on their way to their youth group right now, they're about to walk in and sure, maybe a quarter or more of their students are part of the LGBT community. What does that mean for them? Are they meant to do something, special or different? What is your advice usually when you think about, wanting all of our students to follow Jesus, and then thinking about these particular students that are in this kind of community? What do you advise in that kind of setting?
Yeah, and doing reading and research and walking with other people that struggle in the LGBTQ plus community.
And maybe I can qualify too, just because I know, although you reference, because it's been a struggle, I would assume that there's lots of our students that it's actually not so much of a struggle. They're happy to identify, they're happy to make a transition, they're happy to experience, these particular actions or whatever it might be. So that maybe even is helpful, just to identify the fact that for some of our students, this is something that they may come to us with questions about. But for lots of our students, there's an assumption, this isn't a struggle. There's nothing complicated about this. I've chosen this, or this is who I am, or these are my personal experiences, or this is what's in my heart. Right. And so it's not like I even think about it as a means of having to have a conversation about it, or, it's not a struggle. Right. So I don't know if is that helpful for just kind of categorizing that a bit differently?
Yeah, I think it is. So what I've learned is that, and seen even, there's a book, and I won't go into the details of the book, but it's called Us versus Us. And it was one of the largest surveys in the LGBT community on sex and marriage and church and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, just a glimpse of it is most LGBTQ plus people identified as, being raised in a Christian home, and then leaving at the age of about 19. And then, they asked a huge question, because this is, I think, what I would ask too, is well, why did you leave the church? And a lot of, most of them said, 97%, I think, said, we left not because of theological differences about sex and marriage and sexuality, but because of the relational hurt and harm within the church. And so if we come with an aspect of knowing a lot of LGBTQ plus people actually grew up in the Christian home, in the church, and they've left, that's part of my story too, is leaving the church, finding a community, because we were created to want to belong and be loved. And I think that we need to cultivate this environment where we can come and be loved as we are, not affirming exactly what the world and the culture is saying in this particular conversation and topic, but also acknowledging that these are the things. Like, we live in Canada where this is literally something that has been protected, even like the trans conversation around like laws in Canada and all that kind of stuff. And so realizing that it is a big part of our culture, and then acknowledging maybe to our youth and people that we're walking with, if they have hurt or pain from, other Christians or the church, is like, I'm so sorry that you experienced that. Like, I want you to know Jesus and his love and compassion and desire for you to know him.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that we can do in the light of just like people experiencing it. It's very popular right now to identify anywhere on the spectrum, whether it's non-binary, whatever, gay, straight. We're looking to identify as something, and we're seeking and searching to belong to something.
Okay, so I hear you saying there's the sense of what does it mean to experience love and acceptance, not affirmation, but love and
Right.
acceptance. There's something about wanting students to know and to see Jesus. And then maybe I just can ask it this way, because I think sometimes the dance in our minds, and even depends on our own culture, is what's my responsibility between love and acceptance and speaking truth and for the other
Mm.
person to know truth, and recognizing that even sometimes it's different based on the person. So I just think about my own personal examples and stories of like I've wanting to be like, hey, we can be in relationship. I feel like I can be in relationship. We can enjoy each other. We can spend time together. But like I'm a pastor, and so there's like
Yeah.
barriers in terms of I won't be able to perform a ceremony for you. And
Right.
sometimes, even though in my mind I'm like, oh, but everything else is on the table. Like, let's be friends and let's hang out. And for the person that I'm talking with, sometimes just the fact that they know I won't perform a ceremony is enough for them to say, well, we cannot be friends. Like, that breaks
Right.
relationship. You are now my enemy. And like some pretty intense challenges with that, which in some
Yeah.
ways I can understand, because there's a guard up for some folks because of where
Right.
hurts come from. But how do we know what is harmful and hurtful, what's loving, when even sometimes the person we're trying to love might experience things different than even what we intend, or maybe even different than what they are? I don't know, does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. We're all going to experience things in different ways in light of how we perceive the world, how we perceive the truth. And so, some things that we are going to say as youth leaders and workers are going to maybe not sit well with somebody. But I think if we can cultivate a place, and hopefully they want to stick around enough because they see how we love one another and how we're trying to get to know them and understand what they're wrestling with and struggling with, they might stick around long enough to then get into heart conversations about, like,
Yeah.
this is what I perceive myself to be, or this is even like what I see sexuality to be. Maybe I've never even understood that God, designed something a certain way and it was really good, and because of the fall, it's fractured and we experience this brokenness within ourselves and this sexuality that is just broken in each of us. And really digging into those, because I think sometimes we think that truth is not always loving, but we have to do it in a way that we're not always just throwing truth bombs without
Mm.
building relationship. And that person inviting us into their lives and into those places. I think as youth workers, we just have a really unique place. Like you said, we don't have always the place where we can just, say certain things or do certain things. There's wisdom that needs to be shown as a youth worker and a pastor. That's maybe different from someone just meeting a youth, at church, and then you're engaging in a different way.
Yeah, and I know from our conversations because we've been able to talk lots. I'm fascinated by when you were coming out to your pastors who didn't realize your full story. They didn't understand or
Right.
know before they ever made statements or made declarations or tried to teach you the truth of some kind. Whatever that might mean to people. They asked you like lots of questions, and
Yeah.
so that could be really helpful actually for us as youth workers trying to understand and know. Hey, when we've got a student they may not even believe anything that we believe. They may not even
Right.
want to submit to Jesus, or they may not want any of what we've got as Christians.
Yeah.
But they might be intrigued at the questions we could ask them. What were some of the things that you felt were loving and helpful in terms of the questions you heard from the Christians as you were kind of coming out to them?
Yeah, that's great. I think sometimes my personal story is like as a LGBTQ plus person walking into the church in recovery where we were told like, oh, you believe in a God of your own understanding. However, I did have, church background growing up. But I had a distorted view of God and his character. And so what we started to do is just open up the word of God, build relationship with one another. But my pastor's wife, what she did is like in our conversation, she's like, well, I want to understand you. Will you share your story with me? And I was desperate to share my story. I actually
Mm.
told her before she even asked my story because I just wanted her to know me. And having these secrets was so difficult for me to hold in. And so I was desperate for someone to ask me and want to hear my story. So I think that we need to realize that, like, usually LGBTQ plus people are marginalized and shut out, quieted within the church community or society in general. And so, as youth workers and as Christians, we can ask them to, like share their story, like what we were talking. And she asked me this specific question is like, what do you identify as? And this was, 4 or 5 years into my transition and just wanting to know that because if we don't have a base for anything, like here's what we believe biblically, but what do you even see as yourself as? And so I said, I believe in my full transition, I'm a straight male. And she was like, oh, okay. Well, now I have some kind of ground where I can go, okay, now what does that mean? Let's unpack that more,
Amazing.
if you're willing to do that. And then we started there, and then, lots of questions. I even had really big questions that I wanted to ask, that I was hoping to get question or answers back from her, not
Mhm.
just, I don't want to ruffle any feathers, but they do say that they were, you know, there was I wouldn't say a fear, but like we don't want to lose you as a friend. We don't want to push you away. We don't want to make you feel like you're rejected. And so how do we do that? Well,
Oh,
walking
oh,
and wrestling with one another
okay.
in deep, hard ways.
So you've given three questions, and I think this is probably going to be, at least for this conversation, let's just pause on these three questions because I think these are brilliant. And then we'll come back and we'll keep talking about this stuff.
Right.
Okay, so question number one that you referenced that was helpful as you were part of. So we think about as youth workers, we got somebody like Kyla in our small group, who at that point isn't Kyla, but also isn't necessarily submitting fully to Jesus, and that's great in relationship in the small group in the circle. Tell me your story being question number one. Now that can probably come out as different types of questions, but to
Mhm.
tell me your story is that overarching one. Tell me more
Right.
about you. Tell me more about your journey. Tell me more about what makes you you. Those kinds of questions, like you referenced, the fact that you were so wanting somebody to be interested in your story. I think it goes to the fact
Right.
that we all wish somebody would care deeply about our story. And if, as youth workers, one of the things we do for our students is to appreciate, to show them the love of God in a way of being known in our community is so strong. So that
Yeah.
idea of like, let me understand more about you as you say the story.
Right.
I think that's fascinating. I think the second thing you said was, um, what do you identify as? There's probably other ways that we can ask that question as well, depending on the student. But
Yeah.
tell me more about your identity. Tell me more about,
Right.
and when you said, like, I see myself as a straight male, even qualifiers, and you kind of referenced a couple of those, like, what does that mean for you? Tell me more about how you came to that spot. How does that make your decisions about, X, Y, or Z? That idea of trying to understand, because my guess, you tell me if I'm wrong, Kyla, is that even for our students, that internal wrestling for any of us about who we are is not fully formed. We don't really
Right.
know it. And so the act of that conversation actually even reveals things to our own hearts and minds about
Yeah.
how we've told stories about who we are just generally. Would that be fair to say?
I think so. Totally fair. Yeah.
And maybe, again, I just think of, like, if somebody asked me that question right now and I'm like in my later 30s and like a dad with 3 kids, I'm like, ooh, that's going to cause a lot of introspection. And like, do I have to pay you for this kind of counseling session? Because
Right. Right.
it's going to be valuable.
Yeah.
So that identifying and like, how do you see yourself? I think that's so fascinating. And then the third thing you said, which again, we got to go to, is, okay, your pastor said to you, we don't want you to feel like we're pushing you away or that we don't love you. We don't want you to experience being on the outs. What should
Right.
we do so that that doesn't happen? I
Yeah.
think allowing you to just speak, hey, this is what I would love to experience as a part of this community, is so helpful. I don't think everybody will necessarily know what to say in that setting or even
Yeah.
maybe fully hear it, but the idea that we would qualify and clarify for our students, hey, just so you're aware, you are welcomed here. You can be here. We want you here. Help us
Yeah.
understand what will make you feel that way.
Right.
I think is probably really valuable to give them a chance at vocalizing what they would like to experience. Now, that doesn't mean that we can always offer that. Hey, the
Yeah.
best way for me to feel loved and accepted is if every time I come in here, you hand me a $20 bill. Well, that may not work, but
Yeah.
the context of at least understanding where somebody's coming from and maybe where we can offer the kind of grace and love and charity and community based on what they're hoping for would be
Right.
really valuable. Because for some
Yeah.
students, it's going to be so clear and simple. It's like, oh my goodness, if that would make a difference to you, absolutely, we can do that. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Those 3 questions seem fascinating to me. Is there anything you would want to say in response to those, or do you still agree with those? I know you
Yeah,
just said them, but
absolutely. I think it's really important, like, when we're also asking people about their stories and all this, we can, like, so youth groups happen in multifaceted ways. Like, we have gatherings, we have outings, like, we have teaching and all that. We could do it in a more intimate,
mm,
isolated way. Like, okay, we're not. Maybe this person doesn't feel comfortable, which I don't know a teen really that feels really comfortable going. And even myself, like here, well, I shouldn't say that. I tell everybody about, but like, I'm not gonna usually share my story in front of like 15
right.
peers or 100 peers. And so, like, how can we, alongside having fun in youth group and having serious conversation, maybe pull them aside and ask those deep questions, whether or not it's with one youth worker or two together, but just letting them know that you value their story and
Yeah.
understanding what makes them like, what experience do you have that kind of create this experience and feelings, because usually it's like how we were brought up, our childhood, like our school, like all these experiences that are actually underneath. And the most important thing is like, how can we get to a youth heart? Because that's what we want. We want their heart to know Jesus and their heart to experience His freedom in His love and grace and mercy that He lavishes on us as believers. So that's one area that I would think is very
Yeah.
important.
And really wise, because yeah, there's some youth workers that are like, oh, perfect, my 3 stories are all set. So like, brand new kid in group just showed up tonight. My first question to you: tell me your story and what do you identify as, and how can we make sure you feel? And the kid's like,
Yeah.
whoa, whoa, whoa. So yeah, let's use some emotional intelligence along the way. but at least recognizing,
Yeah.
hey, these are three questions that we can have, hold on to, and find our
Yeah.
ways to deploy them to be hopefully thoughtful and loving to all of our students. I
Yeah.
think that would be really valuable. Well, let's leave it there for today,
Yeah.
Kyla, and then I'll make sure people know, and we'll put this in the show notes, that your ministry is a growing one. You've been speaking at conferences, sharing your story over Zoom,
Yeah.
being able to leverage technology to help and communicate
Mhm.
with churches and ministries all across our country and beyond. And so people can catch up with you there, but we'll
Awesome.
certainly have you back. And if people have got questions for Kyla and you would like us to bring those into this podcast format, I always include my contact info in the show notes. Let me know, and we'll bring you back for another great conversation, Kyla. But thanks for these three
Awesome.
questions that we can leverage and ask our students.
Thank you. So good to be with you and talk with you. Yeah.
All right. We'll see you guys next time here on the
Take care.
Volunteer Youth Worker Podcast.